one of the things we're always going to do, whether we're doing it through the medium of together on Zoom, looking in small groups at them, and then coming back and discussing as a larger group, or whether we look at them together as a group, as we're going to do today, when we look at these discussion contributions, that's going to be a part of class. I'm going to be disciplined about doing that. We're always going to spend at least 30, maybe even 40 minutes working with your discussion questions. So it's important for you to prepare for class by approaching the assigned material, having good discussion questions, learning to make. There are two things that I'm aiming for you to learn through these assignments, and you have to read that document, how to make discussion contributions, carefully to get what I'm hoping that you'll get. The first thing is to learn and really practice the technique of asking open-ended questions. Open-ended questions, of course, are, they're different than a yes or no question or a multiple choice question. Which ice cream is your favorite flavor, vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry? It's not an open-ended question. But what's your favorite ice cream flavor might be an open-ended question. But both of those are not very open in that I'm just asking you for your opinion, and once you've stated your opinion, the discussion is over, right? Because there's no arguing with taste. In Latin, the phrase is de gustibus non disputandum. There's no arguing with taste. So what kinds of open-ended questions are we looking for? We're looking for questions that begin with words like, what are some ways that, right? If I say, what are some ways that, I'm already priming you to think that there might be more than one way to answer my question. And there are many, many ways that you can phrase open-ended questions, but they're characterized by requiring thought. No, that has a GH. Thought, research, reasoning, argument to answer, the good ones, right? Good open-ended question is going to require a respondent to use one of those four things. The other thing that I'm asking for in how to make discussion contributions document is statements that I'm calling contestable statements. And once again, de gustibus non disputandum. It is not possible to argue with taste. So contestable statements are not things like this. I prefer chocolate. Right? What are you going to say? No, you don't. You like vanilla. Right? That is not how that's argued. That is not how that conversation is going to go. It's going to go like this. I prefer chocolate, and someone else is going to say, well, I prefer vanilla, and the conversation is over. A contestable statement, generally speaking, isn't going to be about your preferences, your feelings. Probably is not going to be about your beliefs. Right? I just feel is a thing I hear a lot. I just feel that X, right? If I say I just feel, then I might not be making a contestable statement, because you're not, if you've ever been married or had a long-term relationship with someone and you tried to tell your partner that they didn't feel what they were feeling, you're not going to get very far. You don't feel that way. Like bump into someone and they're like, that hurt. That didn't hurt you. Yeah. Don't go down that road. Contestable statements are things like, there were more people at our event than have ever been at any event in the history of Mars Hill University. Right? If you have an event and you're an organizer and you say, there were more people at our event than were ever there. Someone else might say, that is not true. There was no one there. There were 50 people at your event. There was practically nobody. There's like 1,000 students in the school. Only 50 people came to your event. Like, there were more than 50. And now you have an argument, right? You can use, again, research. It involves claims. Contestable statements involves claims about things in the world, also known as objects. Objects are matters that are at hand, matters that you and I can both approach. This table has 5 sides. No, this table has 4 sides. But if here it is, and we can appeal to this table, someone else, smarty, will say, actually, this table has 6 sides because there's a top and a bottom. Really? Okay. But anyway, the point is that through argument, we can arrive at some kind of agreement about the object that we're approaching in the world. And the contestable statement is like that. You can contest it, and then through some kind of process of finding agreement, these claims about things in the world can be adjudicated. You can adjudicate a contestable claim with appeals to evidence, reason, in short, with argument. It doesn't mean that you'll always find agreement. A great example of a contestable claim that has failed to be resolved over 2,000 plus years of it being made is the man Jesus from Nazareth rose from the dead and ascended into heaven. Right? That's a great example of a contestable claim because by its very nature, it's making a claim about something in the world that theoretically we could approach. We could perhaps adjudicate it by appealing to evidence. Or we might decide we don't have enough evidence to adjudicate it in a way where we'll find agreement. Just because it's contestable doesn't mean we can resolve it. But if I was to say, I believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, you see the difference? Who are you to tell me what I believe or don't believe? I'll tell you what I believe. That's the difference between a contestable and a non-contestable. We're not talking about testimony, we're talking about claims. And the difference between a claim and a testimony is that the claim is working in this intersubjective space of academic argument. Jesus is about the most contested figure in the history of humanity. That's my claim, right? And someone else wants to say, no, there's someone else more contested. I'm like, bring it on. Let's have the argument. Let's consider the evidence. I love that. That sounds like a great argument to have. Right? Who's the most contested figure in the history of humanity? Maybe Jesus. One of the reasons why I find it interesting to talk about. Okay, so I hope that this is just overview is clear. And then, of course, the questions and this contestable statements are supposed to be your responses to assigned course materials. That could be stuff that happens in class. More importantly, the things I assign for that day's readings. So let's take a look at what you guys produced for today. Actually, let's just take a breather for a moment. Does anyone have any questions about this?
It makes more sense now that you've explained it, because like trying to read it on my own, I was kind of like confused on what was been going and not having like examples.
I'm sure that's my bad. It's like, yeah. I'm trying to explain myself.
Yeah, it's just hard to like.
So I like put it in highlight. I'm like, I'll highlight this, then they'll get it.
I mean, I did my best. If it's not right.
No, that's that's the other thing. This is low stakes, y'all. If you participate, you're getting credit.
So would you like us to kind of speak about, like, I know you want us to do it based on one of the readings that we for the videos. So you want us to kind of talk about that a little bit and then transition to an open-ended type of question?
That sounds fantastic. Sounds great. Do it. Yes. Yes.
So like, when we post in the discussion, like, does it matter like what reading we choose?
No, don't do all of them.
Okay.
Focus on some element. One of the this is a great thing. This is a little. I don't want to encourage you to slack off or anything, but all you have to do is identify one element of one of the assigned readings, right? Just get engaged just a little bit, enough to make that discussion contribution, and then we'll see where that goes. Yeah, don't do one for every. Just the one that you thought that moved you most. So, you did it all. You do it all. You're like, you vibe it all. And then you're like, what's sticking with me after it is this moment in this particular text, which raises for me this discussion question, or which makes me want to make this contestable statement, right? You have any questions about that, Kayla? I don't know how to, I'm just going to, hi, do you have any questions about it? Okay, I'm going to try not to draw too much attention to you in the little window there. But if you do have, if you want to make a contribution, you can unmute yourself and shout. We'll probably hear you. I don't know. Hopefully. All right, well, let's go down. I'm going to look at the day 2 discussion contributions. When you make, I didn't realize, I was dumb. I just thought, oh, every student can just open it up and they'll make their contribution. They can't see other people's contributions until they did. I didn't realize until someone in the class, who was that? Might have been Kayla, might have been someone else who said, I can't make a discussion contribution. You haven't posted a question. So this is the question, but the question, as Stephen pointed out, is not a question. It just is like, what? It just says this.
I thought mine was like glitching. I thought like something wasn't showing up.
Right. It's not really a question. And then I see that 10 people posted things. And you can see this too. Once you've posted yours, you can see how many have come before. Of course, you can always come back. We'll do small group things occasionally where I'll put 2 or 3 of you together, and your assignment will be to look through it and decide like what's one question we want to discuss and how would we discuss it, and then come back. And then we'll winnow down from multiple discussion questions or statements to stuff to spend time on in class. But today we'll just go through and see what we can find. Is it going to let me open it? I have read these already. That's why I have you turn it in an hour before class, so I have a chance to read them. So our first one was submitted by Kayla, and I will read it out loud. In reference to Jesus gets his own calendar for 2015. So this is a reference to material we looked at in day 1. Or actually, it's a reference to the article by Zach Hunt, which frankly, that's a bummer. 2 things have happened. That was on his old blog, and then I moved it over to his new blog. On the old blog, all the links to the pictures worked, and on the new blog, they don't. And I feel like on the old blog, he had a whole couple more paragraphs where he said more about his views. And anyway, I'm gonna eliminate that reading in the future. It's enough to just look at the darn catalog or a calendar. I feel like this was belittling Jesus and what he did for us. Not only is it mocking the things he did for us in a way that is taking away the true meaning, but as a calendar for everyone to see, I do not understand the meaning of this article and why someone had the nerve to create something so horrible. I did not enjoy this article or the things within it. The things Jesus did for us were crucial, life-saving, and gave us freedom and life. He gave us love, patience, and kindness, and the things this article is doing is not funny. It is belittling the things Jesus did for each one of us. I'm just going to let that hang there. what shall we, I don't know if Kayla wants to expand on it or if anyone wants to jump in on that.
Seems very passionate.
It's passionate. You can feel, yeah. Yeah, can you empathize with that? Passion? I can.
Yeah, I mean, not so much. I found it amusing, but like not in the sense that.
You found the calendar amusing.
Yeah, but like the fact that just in sort of a not an actual like, funny way, but more so like I can't like did they actually do this? Did they actually kind of in a sense make a fool of them?
The calendar makes a fool of Jesus. So one of the things we don't want to get into, I think, and we can feel Kayla's passion here, but one of the things we probably don't want to get into is like, I was offended. I thought it was funny. You see what I'm saying? Well, because like, of course she found it offensive. And of course you found it funny, and everyone's going to have their feeling reaction. And that passion is a natural part of who we are. Like when we encounter materials in the world, we're going to, like one might say, if Kayla felt offended, that was their point, right? Like they got her goat. And if they also made you think it was funny or me think it was funny, yeah, that was also their point. And so I think there are a couple of statements that Kayla makes that are not just I statements, right? Like she says, you know, I do not understand, that's an I statement. But you ask a question like, why did someone create something like this? She says so horrible, which is, you know, a value judgment. But why did someone create this calendar is a question that's embedded here, right? So maybe we didn't address that enough last day. Why did someone do that? Just
I mean, like Jason said, for amusement. Could have been for amusement or just.
so when you say for amusement, for their own amusement?
Yeah. I guess I don't know what the context of the whole magazine was. Like, that's also a question.
What is that context, right? Got guys who are obviously artists, maybe artist models, maybe they're humorists, I don't know.
I thought it was like satire, but it doesn't really take itself too seriously. So that's how I interpreted it. I thought it was funny.
Right, so like, we're back to the I thought it was funny. And I think they made it to do satire. And then the question, and not just really ultimately a deferral of the question, why satirize Jesus, right? Why pick Jesus as the target?
Well, couldn't this also be an instance of don't listen to your haters, listen to your fans? Because like they probably knew when they were creating this that there'd be quite a lot of backlash. But at the same time, it's like we don't need to focus on the people that dislike this, but more so the people that are going to enjoy this.
Maybe they were after that backlash. Maybe they're looking for controversy. Maybe doing this gets them clicks. Maybe it's money, right? You use people's anger to enrich yourself. Maybe that's it. Too cold out there, gentlemen? Sorry.
I saw it as trying to fit the social norm.
Say that again.
Trying to fit the social norm, like what we're in today, because a lot of times when you go out and you look at like things you see like on magazine covers or even calendars you see out in like the mall and stuff, you see all these models that are out there that are half dressed and trying to pose like sexually. I feel like they were trying to fit the social norm and say, oh, okay, well, if they can do it, then you can do it too. And it'd be perfectly okay. And that's all it is, just trying to fit everybody in one category.
One of the things that occurs to me is that maybe someone who finds that this portrayal of Jesus distasteful, maybe someone, I don't know, might also, in another context, like a calendar with some firemen on it. You know? Like, and maybe they're trying to satirize moral hypocrisy. Maybe. Are they missing the target? Maybe. So here's another contestable claim embedded in this. The things Jesus did for us were crucial, life-saving, and gave us freedom in life. How do you react? How do you respond?
Playing devil's advocate, some people could say that, I mean, people that don't believe in Jesus Christ or their religion, we could say that that's not true, and it's all science. It's what Earth was created.
I can almost imagine someone saying, Jesus never did anything for me. What are you talking about? Right? Like it's contestable. And then there's a fight, or so what's the evidence, you might say. And remember, contestable statements make claims about things in the world, and we have to be able to adjudicate them, evidence, reason, and argument. So one of the problems that we have when we make a big claim is that we may not be able to do anything else but appeal back to our faith to back it up. Like if I make the claim, I know that life has meaning, right? You'll be like, and one of you, a cynical person might say, what's your evidence that life has meaning? And I'm like, I just have faith that it does. Well, argument's over. I just stopped the conversation. We have to be careful sometimes. This helps explain the passion, right? If this is the belief, it helps to explain why the satire offends. Now, one of the things that occurs to me, I like to start the class with this really provocative, weird thing, because I think it's gross and weird, right? Like, that's my contestable claim. This is a gross and weird calendar. You got Jesus kind of lifting up his robe to show his butt cheek. What is wrong with you people, right? Like, those are my reactions, my personal reactions. And then, but I observe that and I think the power of this icon in the culture to evoke these kinds of responses from people is what's at play here. And so you might say to yourself, that's not the way to portray Jesus. And I'm like, okay, great, because this class is about, in part, what is the way to portray Jesus, right? Well, if that's not it, what is? What's your evidence? How are you going to do it? How do you think Jesus should be represented? How come you put a robe and long hair and a beard on a white guy and people are like, that's Jesus, right? That's not what Jesus looked like, man. That's my contestable claim, right? Like, but yet we have this icon. If Kayla doesn't mind, if you guys don't mind, I'll move on to the next. There's another contestable statement here about the Saxby brothers. So before we move topics, let's find that. Sarah, don't ever want anyone to feel called out by this process. You made a contribution. We appreciate that. On the calendar, Sex of Jesus by the Saxby brothers, I was not immediately offended. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Were you later offended?
No.
Okay. So it didn't happen immediately and it didn't happen later.
No, not at all.
Okay, good.
I can understand how somebody would be offended, but I was not offended.
Right, okay. Excellent. I was more confused because I did not find the pictures sexy. That is what interests me here. I mean, it's a personal statement, right? That's preference, no disputing taste. But it is understood there to be offensive to Christians, not because it has a picture of two Jesuses together, but because it sexualizes the idea of Jesus. What I like about that is that is an analytical, contestable statement that Sarah has made, right? These pictures are offensive to Christians, not because of two Jesus together, but because of sexualizing the idea of Jesus. That's an interesting concept. It raises a couple of questions for me. What's wrong with sexualizing Jesus? Or what's offensive about sexualizing Jesus? Did Jesus have sexuality? Can sexuality be a part of representation of Jesus? Right? Or is that off limits because he's divine? He's God. You see what I'm getting at? I think Sarah nailed that theme through her question, through her statement. So what do you think? Forget about sexy Jesus. Can Jesus be sexual?
I mean, yes, it can, but that's not what you want to think. It's like if you look at this, let's say, pastor like Martin Luther King, you don't think about him cheating on his wife or Nelson Mandela. You don't think of him doing this. You think of all the good things that he did. So if you're overshadowing all these like negative, like sexualizing him, it's kind of like not necessarily the picture you want to paint.
Right, like Jesus, obviously, if he was human, went to the bathroom like everybody else, but that's not depicted in any of the Gospels. And we don't talk about it when Martin Luther King Jr. went to the bathroom either. There's something about, I mean, I just reached for the scatological, and we were talking sexual. Bathroom talk is something we don't do, right? That's taboo. Sexuality, though, is something that we do talk about and include in our thinking about human life, and then Jesus is somehow in another category.
I would argue people have already sexualized Jesus.
How so? Can you give an example?
I don't want to open this can of worms, but
You already did.
Yeah, the whole debate over homosexuality, people using the Bible and their religion to justify a proven or disproven, like whether that's a holy behavior or whatnot. I feel like just by doing that, you're sexualizing Jesus in some way.
That's such an interesting point to me, and I think that it's worth adding to that point that people also talk about marriage in the context of Jesus, right? And use him to authorize, and words he's stating about marriage and divorce to authorize heterosexual marriage or to argue for only a heterosexual sexuality. So they use Jesus to authorize a certain type of sexuality, and then they also try to delegitimize another form of sexuality, and that's at your point, right?
Yes.
I mean, then we have to just break down sexuality.
Okay.
Like what exactly are you defining as sexuality?
Yeah.
It's like what he's saying is it's just kind of the idea that okay, homosexuality it's in the same context of that refers to sexuality. So what's like the definition of sexuality?
I would love to hear what people think. I have my answer to that, of course, but like, what constitutes sexuality? If I said so-and-so is a sexual person, what does that mean? It's funny, I said sexual. Okay, go ahead, I'm sorry.
You have like the social norm where everybody kind of accepts to be healthy and healthy being sexual. But if you say someone has the specific trait of being sexual, it's like they're deviating from that.
Oh, so the way I said it is a deviant, implies deviance. I agree. The way I said it was meant to be funny, and it implies deviance. But you're saying there is this sort of human mean of sexuality.
Yes. Within.
So you're talking more in the physical context. Is what you're saying. This is not what you're saying.
Is this a question for me then?
Yeah.
Okay. I was going for more of the abstract concept of sexuality rather than just being physically attracted to someone.
But the way you phrase that to me is
So we have biological sex, right? And we have gender. And then we have sex preference or sexuality preference. We have sexual behavior, and we have sex organs, and we have erogenous zones, and like this stuff doesn't get brought up around Jesus very much, right? Did Jesus have sex?
Yes.
In the biological sense, did he have a sex? In the biological sense.
Wait, are you talking about asexual sex?
I'm talking about both. I don't want to get too vivid here, but Jesus was circumcised on the 8th day, according to the Gospel of Luke. Right? Like, Jesus' penis is mentioned in the one of the Gospels. So, indirectly, by reference to his foreskin, which was removed. This is not the last time I will talk about circumcision in this class. Circumcision was a huge issue in early Christianity, a huge issue. Like it is a giant part of the letters of Paul. Really get that if you take my intro New Testament class. We won't talk about it too much. But he's not portrayed as having a girlfriend or a wife. But there's huge debate because there are some early Christian texts which imply relationships between Jesus and women. There's a whole tradition of apocryphal literature that implies that the Bible that we have of Jesus is wrong, that he was actually married to Mary Magdalene, and they had a whole bloodline, and this whole Dan Brown, Holy Blood, Holy Grail thing, the bloodline of Jesus and the Merovingian kings of France and blah, blah, blah. I mean, people have talked about this stuff. The movie, The Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis, it's by Martin Scorsese, based on the novel by Nikos Kazantzakis. The thing that drives people crazy about it is that the last temptation of Jesus Christ is that he's on the cross and he uses his divine power to flip the script and go back to a normal householder life where he's married to Mary Magdalene and they're having children and he's skipping out on the whole Jewish war with Rome and he's just leading the ordinary guy's life, and that's his last temptation, is just to be an ordinary human being, and that includes sexuality and reproduction and things like that. So this question, and that's incredibly controversial, even though in the movie and in the book he ends up back on the cross, he ends up choosing atonement, and he had that power, so he does it in this novel. These kinds of things offend people's sensibility because they don't want to think about Jesus in a sexual fashion. But if he was human, you can imagine the questions I could start to ask, right? If he was an adolescent boy for some number of years before he began his ministry, what sexuality was Jesus? He liked to hang out with men a lot, and he had a bunch of girlfriends, and he had a disciple that he loved and used to lean on his breast at the dinners, according to the Gospel of John. You can imagine where people take all this stuff, right? And the arguments that come up from all this. So what seems like initially, like maybe it's like this is a deep well of stuff. Like, okay, have we exhausted that topic for now?
Sure.
Yeah, we're making you uncomfortable a little bit.
A little bit. It's fine.
Please stop, Dr. Baldwin. Please stop. That's Jesus. Don't do that to Jesus. Okay, I'm going to scroll down to the second question, which Ashley submitted. Love this question, of course. How differently do the New Testament Gospels portray Jesus compared to the Old Testament Gospels, and what are some of the key differences that Intel can, like, that's like a slang, I think. Intel meaning like inform or give substance to. The idea of Jesus in each of the Testaments. I don't want to embarrass you or anything, but there are no Gospels in the Old Testament. Just want to point that out. There are Old Testament books.
Yeah.
And then there are 4 Gospels in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then there are these other Gospels. And one of the things that distinguishes what we call a Gospel from other forms of literature is that in the Christian, that the Gospel genre in Christian tradition, they're characterized by having a focus on Jesus. And so Jesus, of course, is not born in the Old Testament period, and there aren't any Gospels in the Old Testament because he hasn't been born yet and no one's telling his story yet. Although there is a book out there that is called, I think, Isaiah the Fifth Evangelist, which argues that the prophet Isaiah is so much like covertly, secretly about Jesus that he's like a fifth evangelist, but we still call it the book of Isaiah. Okay, how differently do the New Testament Gospels portray Jesus compared to the Old Testament Gospels? How am I supposed to understand your question exactly? The 4 New Testament, just like how differently are they among themselves?
Yeah. How they portray them differently.
And what are some of the key differences between them? What I hope is that over the next couple of weeks of the class, we're really going to get into that, right? Like, but if anyone wants to sort of say where they think they're starting on this question, I'd like to hear from you. Where are we starting on? How different is Jesus from gospel to gospel in the New Testament? Can we start there? Can I translate your question like that?
Yeah.
How different is he? Fair question. Is it possible to say to overemphasize the differences?
You know what that sounds like? That sounds like a research question.
Yeah, it does, right?
Yeah. Not enough information to answer it right
You can't answer it yet?
now.
I could answer it, but it might take me about 20 hours. You don't have time, I don't have time. I don't want to blow off the question. I think it's the key question of the class. It's like what we're going to do. So you're like, your curiosity is applauded. It's the key question. But I think we could translate it too. If we say, you're referring to Mark Allen Powell's article, what did the Gospels say about Jesus, right? And there are the 4 Gospels. He is clear. The 4 Gospels each portray Jesus differently. And we can also translate this question, and we can think about it without necessarily research. We could do some speculation. Why would there be 4 Gospels preserved in the early Christian canon, each telling a slightly different, arguably different, we don't know yet how different, story of Jesus? Why? Would you say that's connected? That issue is connected to your question as well?
Yeah.
Different perspectives.
So recording different perspectives. And that was important because,
It's tough for one singular perspective to really get a whole picture. So I think.
okay. So I can imagine like a committee sitting around saying like, if we want people to really understand Jesus, we better make sure they have more than one perspective on it. But I can also imagine a committee going like, I don't know where people are getting all these different ideas about Jesus. What we need is one clear message about it. We're going to get all on the same page here. So we've been doing this for 50 minutes. I want to take a 5-minute break, okay? Because I'm starting to sense some restlessness. This is the length of time of a normal Monday, Wednesday, Friday class. Let's take 5 minutes. Can we do that? All right. I'm going to skip to Danielle's question. I'll come back to Naomi in a minute. Oh. Powell states that historians are skeptical of miracle stories, but much of what is reported in the Gospels is accepted as reliable. However, the Gospels do recall these miracle stories. How do historians differentiate between reliable information and information to be skeptical of when studying the Gospels? Danielle? What a great question. Well-phrased question. What do we know? What do we know about it?
None of us have the topics.
Yeah, that's the toughest part, I feel like, of this conversation. How much is reliable, how much is comparative, how much is...
One of the things we start noticing when we start watching like the Frontline episode or reading Mark Allen Powell's little article or listening to N.T. Wright talk or any scholar talk is we start to notice that scholars don't take the narrative material in the Gospels at face value. They don't say, like you might expect them to say, well, here's the narrative of Jesus. This is what the text says he did. Therefore, he did that. They sift it somehow. But like the way Danielle phrased this question, I feel like it flags a little skepticism on her part, which I think she's entitled to. Because she says they're skeptical of miracle stories, but they accept other stuff. But the miracle stories are in there, so how do they know? Why are they differentiating between miracle stories and the other things? If they're going to accept some in the Gospels, why not all? What is it about miracle stories? We're going to talk about who Jesus really was, like the historians seem to want to. Why wouldn't the historians assume that Jesus was a miracle worker or accept these stories of him working miracles? If I kind of retranslate your question along those lines, I think it starts to be something maybe we can talk about a little bit. Feeling up to it. What do you guys think?
Aren't all like historical texts, especially for like all the technology we are privy to today, where we can't like call up exactly what someone said 1,000 years ago? Should like all like text be treated with some skepticism, because like that text is going to be told from a perspective of whoever's in power at the time? So they're going to put more of a like general good spin on what actually happened. Like if I'm going to tell a story about myself, it's going to be in a more positive light than how someone else would tell a story.
So you're pointing on the one hand to just the general historian's right to be skeptical of any narrative account of something where we don't have access to some corroborating like evidence. Like I remember one time I was in a class on early European religions with the famous scholar of religion, Bruce Lincoln. And he said, like, what would be the best tool that you can imagine to have for doing the history of like early Roman era Spain and France, the religion there. And I raised my hand and I was like a cheeky grad student. I was like, a time machine and a video camera, right? Because the thought is you go back in time with the video camera and you record what happened and then you've got it on tape, right? And that's better than a text, which might be sort of representative of someone's perspective or whatever. What Bruce Lincoln said to me, which was I found very interesting and it's kind of profoundly affected me, is like, he was like, well, yeah, but you know what? Even if you could go back in time with a video camera and point that video camera at some event that happened, like what you would have would still be just someone's perspective on the thing that happened. And it would just be on video. And you can think about like the arguments that happen in our own society about the meaning of tape, right? This is caught on camera. This is caught on cell phone. It's caught on body cam. What really happened? People arguing about it, right? Everything has a perspective, everything. But yeah, I think you're right. We can't just assume that just because something's written down that it happened. If we did that, we would have to end up accepting a lot of stuff. But what makes the story of Jesus different for a lot of people is that they're like, these texts are divinely inspired, they're protected, they're holy, they contain sacred information about a sacred figure that's been guarded by a divine being who guards like you won't hear historians talking that way, right? Some people are thinking that. Well, let's put ourselves in the minds of historians, guys like me who have a PhD working at a university somewhere. Why might historians articulate some sort of skepticism of miracle stories, but not other stuff in the Gospels? What are some reasons why they might? See how I said that? What are some reasons why? What are some reasons why they might be skeptical of miracle stories, but not other stuff? Say what? It's inhuman. Like historians are studying human stuff, and miracle stories are like superhuman stuff. I wonder if you could expand on that just a little bit.
Some stories may be like, how can Jesus do some of the miraculous things he did, like, for example, like walk on water?
Walking on water came to my mind too.
Yeah, like he's a human being, he's a man. Great.
I never seen a man except for that guy, Chris Angel, walk on water. And when I did see Chris Angel walk on water, and I saw it on video, right? I was like, that can't be real. And I immediately said, that can't be real. Because it's not human. But humans don't do that. So there's a humanistic bias in the discipline of history that says miracle stories are inherently improbable. We don't see that stuff happen. So when we see when we see a text that tells us a story that includes a miracle story, we're like, but it's Jesus.
I mean, as much as it's like said it's human bias,
Okay.
And, like, I come from Africa, and I can tell you about like
Magic
magic stories.
stories.
Like literal things that I personally seen and like experienced because of, like, that's how this society is. So I assume that here in the USA, the society just doesn't allow you to think outside of the box because like you guys have like so many social constructs that this is like that. Isn't like
It's like we're raised with like, this is science. It's logic. 2 + 2 = 4. Right? You gotta believe, you gotta accept all these frames, Western scientific empirical frame where you can't operate in this society, right? But if you're raised in a different culture, that skepticism isn't going to be there. So you're saying it's cultural bias against the miraculous. That touches on the truth of the history of the West, of the Western, the rise of empirical scientific methodology from the 17th, or really the 16th century on, from the 1500s on, in the West, that began to cast doubts, the rise of rationalism, science, and the other sorts of forms of this Western scientific frame of mind that is deeply informed academic work and history. So that you could say you've seen magic stories, or you could tell us stories about magic you've seen, and like the vast majority of scholars of religion, with the exception of a couple of people like Jeffrey Kripal or others, would say, so there's got to be some other explanation. It's called the naturalism. It's called natural. We adopt a frame of naturalism. Now, one of the questions you're entitled to ask is whether or not, and this is where this Danielle's question, I just love the way it's phrased, because it's like, how do they know? What gives them, like, okay, it's one thing to be skeptical of miracle stories, but like, if you're taking one text and you're like, I don't believe the miracle stories in it, but I believe the teaching elements are exactly what Jesus said, right? That's kind of a pick and choose skepticism. On the other hand, it doesn't make sense to me logically ever to say one thing in this text is wrong, therefore everything in this text is wrong. That's a fallacy too. But then you're left with some really hard choices. Okay, this is a great way to transition to the topic of the synoptic problem when I have a handout. Is there a rule around handouts? It never even occurred to me. Like I go to a restaurant and I guess to minimize the spread, I will personally hand each one. Then you're only dealing with my germs. And that would make it sure. Everyone should always sanitize their hands, although I think that there's not a lot of evidence for any kind of coronavirus persistence on things like paper. You guys running out of energy?
The day's just
Take a moment to read over the 4 columns here, and I'll just be quiet. And for Kayla's benefit, I will switch my share to what I've just handed out. I'm gonna try to there we go. Sorry we didn't get through all your questions. I am going to shift gears. We're not going to return to the question. Unless someone is like, I want my. You can always go back and make comments on your classmates' posts, by the way. If you want to chime in, that would be most welcome. So they reference Hades? Yes. Why? In Jewish life and thought, which comes out of the Israelite, the cosmos that they believed in had heaven above, like a firmament, the realm of the gods, or God, and the sons of God, the angels. And then the earth, which is resting on pillars, and had pillars of heaven, which were really mountains at the extent of the earth. Windows surrounded this cosmos, and the sun would pass out of the windows of one side and into the other. So it's like kind of a primitive cosmology. And underneath the earth, they spoke of a bottomless, well, there's waters below and waters above in the ancient form of this, but then down in the watery abyss underneath the earth in the dark was a place called Sheol. And in Sheol, the shades of human life would go after death. It doesn't seem in the earliest texts that there's any reference to Sheol, but in later texts, we're talking half a millennium before Jesus, this place called Sheol starts being talked about. And Sheol is this place where, for example, well, probably earlier than a half millennium, maybe even 1,000 years before Jesus, actually. Because like for the most famous example is the story in the book of Samuel where the king Saul is rejected by Yahweh, and he calls up the shade of Samuel from Sheol to get advice from him about a battle. He's about to fight the Philistines. So Sheol, then, that's in Hebrew, right? And then when they start in the Hellenistic period, they start to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek to meet the needs of Greek-speaking Jews in Alexandria, in Egypt, which was Greek-speaking at the time, and throughout the Mediterranean world, but also to start to meet the needs of upper-class Jews that are living in Judea and Palestine. So in the translation, they were like, how do we translate Sheol into Greek? And so they went to the Greek cosmology, and in Greek cosmology, the word Hades refers to something that's very, very similar to the Israelite concept of Sheol. In fact, sort of culturally, not etymologically, not at the level of language, but at the level of culture and cultural diffusion, maybe the ideas of Sheol and Hades are ultimately related. But in Greek thought, of course, there's a god named Hades, who's one of the Olympians who presides over a place which is also called Hades. And the underworld, the idea of the underworld where the dead go, permeates the ancient world. It's cross-cultural, it's Egyptian, it's Mesopotamian, it's Greek, it's Israelite, it's Canaanite. So Hades refers to Sheol in Jewish thought, in Orthodox Jewish thought, if you will. But it's this Greek word that, of course, is the name of a god. Right. Great question. Did they mention that when Saul talks to the prophet? Did they say like Hades? It's called Sheol because it's Hebrew, right? Because it's Hebrew. Okay. But if you look at the Septuagint translation of that, it'll be Hades. Okay. And so that calling Sheol Hades starts a couple hundred years before Jesus' birth, the third century BC, among Jewish literature. Sometimes it does seem as though Hades gets personified as a form of like a divine being, a semi-divine being, a god of death. Yeah. Even in Christian thought, death, capital D, right? I mean, you notice, for example, Hades here is said to have gates, right? The gates of Hades. Who built the freaking gates? Right? Who maintains them? Satan, of course, you know how it goes. That Christians have their underworld figure, and Jews too. But Satan is a transitional figure in many texts. I mean, his role transitions over time. That takes us too far afield. Okay, so what we have here? What do we have here? We have, yes.
Well, first, I'm very glad what I said when we were speaking about the open discussion, and also what you said about how there's different perspectives of it, but also how we need to kind of centralize one. It seems pretty centralized that there's kind of a theme, but there was four separate.
The differences here are noticeable. Which is the most different?
The last one.
Yeah, which is John here. And these are presented to you in the canonical order, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, right? The first three Gospels here, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are usually referred to as the synoptic Gospels. And I think our chaplain, Stephanie, said to me the other day, I think it was our chaplain. I think she mentioned to me that she felt like if you could get through a class on Jesus at Mars Hill and you didn't know that the Synoptic Gospels were Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that it was a problem. So I want to make sure here on day 2 of the class that if there's one thing you learn in this class, it's that the 3 Gospels, Matthew, abbreviated MT, Mark, abbreviated MK, and Luke, abbreviated LK, are known as the Synoptic Gospels. And they are called synoptic because syn means together and opsis means seeing, and they are said to see together. And not only that, but you can put them in what is called a, quote, gospel synopsis. And you can ask me right now, what's a gospel synopsis? And I'll say, you're looking at one, or part of one. A gospel synopsis is when you set parallel passages from the Gospels side by side so that you can see them together, right? And it is one of the mistakes I made in designing this class that I didn't order you Throckmorton's Gospel Parallels, which I usually assign in this class, and I can't believe I didn't assign it this year. If you want a really good book you'll use for the rest of your life studying the Gospels, Throckmorton's Gospel Parallels cost you about $40, I suppose, in today's dollars, maybe 30, I don't know. You can probably get one used because they're used all over the place. It's a great, very accessible arrangement of the Gospels in parallel columns so that you can see all the parallel passages together. So when we relay Matthew, Mark, and Luke together, we see very, very similar materials, like you see here. But there are still differences between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then usually, you just can't put John into that synopsis, how close is this material from John to the rest? That's weird. I just said John, and John Griffin Trump just texted me.
It just has the same theme, but then
There's a similarity in theme. Does that extend to content?
not entirely.
Not really.
It just feels like it was a leap. Like in Matthew, I feel like that had the most context out of everything.
And by context, you mean like just content? Like there's
Yeah.
it's longer.
Yeah, and like for
It's giving you
reasons-
more material.
Yeah, to work with.
Yes.
Whereas like you have the bolded statement that Jesus is basically being portrayed as a Messiah or God himself. And then it skips to talking about one of the 12 is the devil without any like. I just like I felt like it was a jump, whereas Matthew like explained why.
Is that what you were getting at?
I believe that while Matthew might have more content, it's just phrased in that early rhetoric. So
It's more rhetorical.
Yeah, it's just that. I mean, to me, that difficult, like that early form of writing where it's more difficult for me to understand at least.
Okay. There's a lot of
Yeah, and Mark,
flowery.
and I felt like Mark was just more concise, but also got the full.
Mark seems to have the fullness. Matthew's elaborated. Luke's short. John's short. But I think actually, now, sorry, you got to remind me. Oh, duh. Now I'm just going to zero in on that for a second. My friend Matthew here you were talking about what makes the John material similar, right?
Yeah, and dissimilar.
And so he was. I like what you were saying because it's like there's a structural similarity here. You've got Jesus talking to his disciples. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's talking to the 12. He asks them a question. He's talking to 12. He asks them a question. And in response, Peter replies and calls him something, uses a title that gives him a divine honors, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then Jesus mentions that one of the 12 is a devil. And it says he was talking about Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, for he, though one of the 12, was going to betray him. Now, those parallels are thematic rather than content, right? Because the setting of Jesus talking to his disciples could happen anytime, anywhere. So theme, right? Theme is, by definition, if something happens more than once, that's a theme. So Jesus asking a question, thematic. Because what's the question in the 3 synoptic gospels? What's the question?
Who do they say? Like, who do they say I am?
Who do people say that I am, in the words of Mark, right? And Luke is a little different. Who do the crowds say that I am? So you have the difference between people and crowds. And then Matthew says, oddly, who do people say that the Son of Man is? Right? But in comparison with the other two, it seems like, we would probably say, well, that must be another way of saying I, or he's referring to himself as the Son of Man. We'll set that observation aside for the moment. So the question in John, though, is, do you also wish to go away? not a question like, he's not asking who people say he is. And the context, this is why I wanted this Matthew to specify you meant detail or material to work with, not context, because context in my use of the word means the stuff before and after, right? Or, so the stuff that's not on the page is the context.
Okay.
Because I have excerpted this from its context.
Yeah.
And there's also a way of talking about contexts which are historical, which are larger contexts than even the text, right? And then there are also literary contexts, which is like other books that are similar to this that provide us with ways of thinking about this. Those are also context. So context is a pretty malleable word. Okay. So how about this? How about I just throw out, to cut to the chase, I throw out a quick theory. John doesn't usually parallel the synoptics exactly at all. And when it does, oftentimes it's really more at the level of thematic parallels. And sometimes they're awfully odd, like this one with 4 in a row, almost like he's transforming something. He's not describing the same scene. This is set in the context of John's gospel in a story that doesn't appear in the synoptics, which is this story where Jesus has been teaching about eating his body and drinking his blood. Jesus starts teaching people in John's gospel, you got to eat my body and drink my blood. And they're like offended and they flee. And then he turns to his disciples and said, what about you guys? You going to go too? Because everyone else is offended at him because he's saying, you got to eat my body and drink my blood, which is, cannibalism and weird and offensive. And drinking blood is explicitly prohibited in Israelite law. And you're like, what? Why would he talk that way? So people are offended and they go. And the context after it says many of his followers left that day too. It's not just like people are taking offense at this in the context of John's gospel. And here Peter says, I'm not going. To whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. And this phrase, Holy One of God, not Messiah, is, or, you could translate this as God's saint. Because sometimes this word hagios, which means Holy One, is just used to mean saint. But it seems to be something more. And then Jesus answered them, and this seems like a non sequitur, right? He's like, didn't I choose you guys? What? The 12? But one of you is a devil. And then the narrator steps in to explain he was not talking about anyone other than Judas Iscariot. Now, who is called Satan in Luke? Sorry. Who is called Satan in Luke? Trick question, my friends. No, the answer is nobody. It doesn't appear in Luke's version of this, and we could go to the context. I haven't chopped it out. I haven't left it out. It doesn't appear in Luke's version of this episode from the Synoptics. Now, in the Synoptics, this material, which is we would refer to as Peter's confession in its standard nomenclature of the stories of Jesus. We call this scene Peter's confession. It's Mark chapter 8, verses 27 to 33. And then we would do this and parallels. That's just a shorthand for parallels. And the parallels are in Luke and in Matthew. And no one would say that John is a parallel. I've just thrown that in there because I see a parallel. But it's not actually parallel. It's not the same scene at all.
So like these are all like supposed to be the same scene?
They are the same scene in the story of Jesus. And this is a pivotal moment, the pivotal moment in the gospel. In the Gospel of Mark, this is the pivotal moment because up until this point, no human speaker has referred to Jesus as Messiah in Mark's Gospel. Now, the word Messiah is Christ. Christos in the Greek. Christos. The word Messiah it means anointed one. And the NRSV translation has chosen to render Christos as Messiah because the theory is that when the Greek-speaking Jews used the word Christos, they meant Mashiach, which is the Hebrew word for anointed one, and it's the word that gets used to refer to God's anointed people like David and Saul, the anointed ones. And the main thing about the anointed one in Israelite thought was the anointed one was the king. The anointed one was anointed by a prophet to be king. In Mark's gospel, the reader knows that Jesus is the Messiah because Mark's narrator tells you in verse 1 that Jesus is the Messiah, right? In verse 1 of chapter 1, he's like, this is the story of Jesus Christ, Jesus the Messiah. But no human individual that interacts with Jesus in Mark's gospel up to this point ever says, you're the Messiah, which is fascinating. The only people who seem to know that Jesus is anything other than just an ordinary human being are demon-possessed people who refer to him as David's son or God's son. And it's the demons inside them that are referring to him because they have access to supernatural knowledge and they know, they recognize. And there's a voice from heaven that says, you're my son. But here's the first place in Mark's gospel where anyone says, you're the Messiah, right?
When you say Mark and Mark, do you mean all of the synoptic gospels or
Just Mark. I'm talking Mark. Yeah, so it's a little bit more, the lines are a little more blurry around what people call Jesus in the other two synoptic gospels. But in Mark's gospel, one of the differences in the portrayal is that Jesus' identity as Messiah is not really confessed by any humans until Peter confesses it here in this scene, which literally stands in the middle of a 16-chapter book, right? In chapter 8, toward the end. And it's right after this. This is the first of 3 places in Mark's gospel. These same 3 places are repeated in Luke and in Mark's gospel, in Matthew's gospel as well, where Jesus tells his disciples what the plan is. He's like, I've been working with you, but here's the plan. We're going to Jerusalem. I'm going to get rejected. I'm going to be killed, and then I'm going to rise again. And in Mark's gospel, Peter says, well, it doesn't say what Peter says in Mark's gospel. It just says Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. That's pretty bold, Peter. Telling off the guy who just called the Lord's anointed, right? Who just said, you're the Messiah. And now he's like, he said, you are the Messiah. That's all he said. You are the Messiah. And then Jesus says, yeah, I am. And here's the plan. He doesn't say, yeah, I am, actually. He just says, here's the plan. In fact, he doesn't say, yeah, I am. He says, don't tell anybody that, right? In Mark's version, he just says, it sternly ordered him not to tell anyone about him. Wow. That, by the way, is the theme of the Messianic secret in scholarly terms. Don't tell. Yeah, in the synoptic gospels, Jesus' identity, especially in Mark, it seems to be where this originates. Jesus doesn't want his disciples to tell people about him and he doesn't want them teaching others that he is the Messiah. Very curious.
Jesus seems shady.
Super shady. In fact, we're going to be talking about Mark in depth on Tuesday, but I'll give you on the next episode of. My shorthand version for the portrayal of Jesus in Mark is that Jesus is portrayed as God's secret agent, as a secret agent from God.
That's what I was thinking. Because like it seems like
He's on a secret mission.
yeah, like don't tell who I am because then my plans could be
My plans will get foiled, right? This is like a secret plan. We're on a secret mission here. Don't tell anyone. And he's just sharing this plan with his disciples. Like his disciples do not know the plan. And Peter's like, that ain't the plan. What are you talking about? I just said you're the Messiah. We have other plans.
I mean, it kind of makes sense because, like, when miracles do occur and people don't know he's the Messiah, I feel like it elevates those miracles even more.
Why is that? That's interesting. What makes you say that?
Because, like, if you immediately identify Jesus as being special, then it's almost expected that he does special acts like miracles. Whereas if he's identified as being just a regular Joe spreading the word, performing miracles, then it leaves it open to emphasize those miracles even more.
That's some human psychology you're throwing down there. I think that's very interesting. We'll have to chew on that one. Okay. So after Peter's like, no, that's not the plan. I'm gonna be coming back to that. I'm not just walking away from Matthew's point here because I think it's very interesting, but Peter takes him aside, began to rebuke him, but turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan. And he calls Peter Satan, which is pretty bold. Now, the word Hasatan in Hebrew can mean the accuser. The word diabolos in Greek, which is not the one that's used here, can mean like something like an accuser. So you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. So it's weird that Jesus hears himself called Messiah by his disciple Peter, and then within a couple lines, he's calling him Satan. Don't you think that's a little odd? So who gets called Satan in Luke? Nobody. Why not? Seems like an important part of the story.
Peter didn't rebuke him.
But it's the same scene, man. Only one thing could have happened. Did Peter rebuke him or not is the question that's embedded in your comment. Did Peter rebuke Jesus or not? In Mark's gospel and in Matthew's gospel, it says Peter rebuked Jesus. Luke doesn't have that detail. Did Luke just forget that detail? Luke wasn't there. There's no doubt that he was not there. Only two of the Gospels are claimed by tradition to have been written by eyewitnesses. That's Matthew and John. Mark is said to have been the disciple of Peter. And Luke writes later. or a Gentile audience after the movement has grown some. That's what we think. But, well, let's just say there's one hypothesis that I find rather persuasive is that if Peter is the head of the church in the iconography at Rome or whatever, and you've got your divine center of the tradition calling him Satan, that kind of undermines the authority of the Petrine tradition. And like, if we can leave that detail out, maybe we should, because it kind of undermines Peter's claim to authority that Jesus called Satan.
So damage control.
Yeah. Or in scholarly terms, the criterion of embarrassment. The criterion of embarrassment would be if something might embarrass the tradition and yet it's in the material, then it tends to be regarded as slightly more reliable. Okay, but Peter also gets rebuked in Matthew's gospel, and another difference in Matthew's gospel is that he doesn't just say you're the Messiah. Peter confesses you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Why is there a difference in what Peter's confession looks like between Mark's gospel and Matthew's gospel?
He's kind of saying he is God.
If you're the Son of the living God, you're certainly divine, right? Now, Mark's gospel also calls Jesus God's Son. Very importantly, at the beginning and at the end. Twice in the beginning. There are only 3 voices that call Jesus God's Son in Mark's gospel, and it's sort of interesting and significant. One is the narrator, who says in verse 1:1, this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. The narrator tells you right off. So you as a reader, you're in on the secret from the beginning. The second one is this voice from heaven, which speaks at the baptism of Jesus. It says, "This is my Son." And you're led to believe that's God speaking, affirming that Jesus is the Son. It's not clear from the text who exactly is aware of this proclamation from heaven, though, among the humans, right? And then finally at the cross, when Jesus is suffering on the cross at the end of the story in Mark, the centurion that's witnessing it says, truly this man is a son of God. Because he can't believe how intensely Jesus is able to suffer without showing any signs of suffering. Plus there's some cosmic signs and other events that convince him that something really important is happening. So the centurion confesses it, and for the reader, it's like Mark saves that for the end and puts it in the voice of a Roman soldier, which is so interesting. Like, it's not coming from Jesus' disciples. Peter doesn't even know that Jesus is resurrected in Mark's gospel. The fact is, in Mark's gospel, Peter's just not that great. Well, we'll get to that. In Matthew's gospel, though, Peter's pretty awesome, right? Peter says, "You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus responds like this. He doesn't say, "Don't tell anyone about me." At least he doesn't say it right away. First, he has a little speech to give. He says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter." Peter, Petros, Greek, means rock. "And on this rock I will build my church." Aramaic word for rock, Cephas. We believe that the man known as Peter had an Aramaic name, Cephas, nickname. By the way, and I'm getting I know this is a little fragmented, but Peter is portrayed as dumb in Mark's gospel. We'll just say that, okay? Keep your eyes out on that. And you wonder whether or not he gets his nickname Peter because he's kind of a blockhead, a rocky. Get it? Like, okay. But in Matthew's gospel, no. "You are Peter," he says, "and on this rock I will build my church." Side note, the word church, ecclesia, in Greek, does not appear on Jesus' lips outside of the Gospel of Matthew. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. That's some pretty powerful authority, right? In the traditional iconography of Western Christianity, Peter is often portrayed as having a pair of keys. His iconography is as a saint. You can identify Peter because he's carrying these keys. And this is where the image of St. Peter at the gates of heaven come from, right? You've often seen that portrayed in cartoons and comics and TV shows and movies and things. Peter up there, he's got a book. It's like, oh, you're here early. Maybe you should go back. That sort of thing, right?
But didn't you say Mark's the one that studied under Peter?
Yeah.
Why is he like hated?
Right. That's a good question. Not only that, if Jesus really said this about Peter, his teacher, Mark's, then why did he leave it out? We'll come back to that on Tuesday, but we'll look at Papias' testimony that suggests that Mark is a student of Peter. I think there are good reasons to doubt that testimony. That's one of them. Or these are two of them. Just if this is hard material to understand, right? Like you were saying, the rhetoric here is hard. And it's because the language is symbolic. Like, what does it mean to say the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church, for example? Does anyone have any?
I mean, when going further down, when he says, God, like, basically Peter taking it aside, and Jesus responds with, like, those are, like, the devil's words, trying to, like, almost say, like, preventing that from, like, happening to other people, I guess. Is that at least how I'm interpreting that?
Oh, like, so Hades, if the gates of Hades prevailed against the church, that would be like the prevention of something happening.
Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting. I mean, the basic meaning of the gates of Hades shall not prevail against the church seems to be that, like, those who die in the movement in the church will not go to Hades. They aren't going to Hades. They're going to heaven. Right? That Hades is below, and Peter's given power over earth and heaven. Whatever he binds on earth will be bound in heaven. So Peter, it is said here, he has the rule-making authority. If you want to do something, you got to ask Peter. If Peter says this is the rule, he has a heavenly authority as well as earthly authority, according to this. You can imagine the Catholic tradition roots its idea of papal succession and papal authority in this Petrine material. Because Peter is said to be the first bishop of Rome, and his laying on hands on the second bishop of Rome and the third bishop and so on goes right down to the current bishop of Rome. This is called apostolic succession, and the current bishop of Rome has the authority granted to Peter to bind on earth, bind in heaven. Or loose, binding and loosing, permit and prohibit. So this is really about giving Peter this enormous authority over an institutional structure known as the church or the ecclesia. But immediately he tells just we're back with Mark, who tells him not to tell anyone. And then Peter does pull him aside, oddly, and he says, God forbid it. So again, Peter is apparently not quite on board with this plan to lose the Messiah and have him be rejected and killed. Even though he's just been granted all this authority, right? And this blessed are you, etc. Jesus still says, you're Satan, get behind me. Because you're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Okay. The relationship among these three texts is hard to explain. There's differences. Those differences are probably not as important as the similarities, though, because the similarities extend to the level of what we would call verbatim agreement. Verbatim agreement. The Synoptic Gospels show a lot of verbatim agreement in their parallel passages. Verbatim agreement is word for word agreement. And what we know as good naturalistic Western historians is that when two texts show verbatim agreement, that there has to be a reason for that. And that reason is going to be one of three options. When two texts, any two texts, show verbatim agreement, if you have A and B, and they have a string of words, and imagine I'm comparing these are words, and the X's are verbatim agreements. This should be a, I don't know, H. And the reader of the text notices that that a sequence of words occur that are exactly the same in the same order, and I'm comparing A and B. I say there's verbatim agreement between these two texts. Like they share the same sequence of the same words. There's only three possible answers. Either B used A, or A used B, or both B and A go back to an unknown source, call it Q. Okay? If there's verbatim agreement. Those are the only three possible. I mean, there's a fourth possible cause, but it lies outside of the naturalistic explanations of things. What's that?
What about conspiring?
Well, they work together.
Yeah, you agree to tell the story in a particular way?
Yes. So, like you and I could go together to a sporting event as reporters, and then we both write up a description of what happened.
Yeah.
Right. And if we both turn in, articles to our editor about the sporting event, and the second and third paragraph of both of our articles are identical, what is our editor going to say to us?
Great job. Let's post it.
Well, no, I mean, if we have co-authors, but we're each submitting our own article. What's our editor going to say?
Post it before the other person. That way the other person gets cited for plagiarism.
Ah, yes, your editor is going to say, you either worked on this together, and I need two different articles here, or one plagiarized the other. Like you guys, which one of you stole from the other one is what the editor is going to say. And the reason why is because we're writing about sports, right? And the way we choose to describe an event that we see in a sporting event is going to be varied based on our own cognition and our own use of language and our own perceptions and perspectives, right? someone ran very fast, there's a bunch of ways you could say that. Now, if someone was giving a speech, and we both happened to report the exact same words that he said, that is still the third one. There is a text. It's what the person said. So words are it's easier to explain verbatim agreement between two, say, written accounts of something if we're describing the words that someone said, because our account is about words. But there's many ways to choose. I could choose to describe what I just saw Stephen do in several ways. I could say Stephen stretched back, opened his mouth, and yawned. I could say Stephen was very tired and bored. I could say whatever I wanted, right? Like, I have a choice if he's not speaking, but I wouldn't want to falsify something he said, and hopefully he wouldn't either, although where are the verbatim agreements here, right? The verbatim agreements are in things like, of course, you have Jesus' speech, who do people say that I am? But in Matthew, it's who do people say that the Son of Man is, slight variation. And in Luke, it's who do the crowd say that I am? So slight variation, but there's so much parallelism, it's very close. Matthew begins, now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, Mark begins, Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Now those are slightly different, but the parallelism is strong, and so there's some variation, but then there's some words that occur that are exactly in sequence, and it's this thing. Notice that Luke is like once upon a time, when Jesus was praying alone, totally different setting. Okay, but take my word for it, there's plenty of evidence here that we've got both verbatim agreement and variation. We also have two different kinds of variation. We have variation that diverges completely away, and then we have variation where different word choices are made. We know with verbatim agreement that we have this situation, A, B, or C, right? B is A, A is B, both B and A go back to Q. Variation can be explained in a variety of ways, including multiple eyewitnesses. But when we have verbatim agreement in the narrative description material, it becomes exceedingly unlikely that it's just two people who happen to come upon the same phrasing because they were both eyewitnesses. So in phrases like, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. In both Mark and Matthew, right? Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. It's said in a particular way with this particular string of words. That's verbatim agreement, and it suggests strongly, verbatim agreement suggests strongly that there's literary relationship. And it's one of these. All these describe a literary relationship.
And since he wasn't there, then that means it would be that date used from B.
Right, like Mark either used Matthew or Matthew used Mark to get that phrase. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him comes either from Mark or from Matthew, or they both go back to another source that they share in common. And that's how they got those words here together. Like it could come from Peter.
Like
Peter could be that cute, right? It could be Peter himself. Could be that cute. Could be an oral source. That's possible.
because it said like Peter told him to pull Jesus aside, right? So these two people aren't present.
Neither of them were there.
Yeah. So either Jesus told them what Peter did, or Peter told them what Peter did.
Something like that's possible. Yeah. One of the problems that we have is that the Mark not being an eyewitness about being a disciple of Peter, maybe the author maybe was a disciple of Peter. That we don't have reliable information that he was. We have a tradition that he was. Is that for most scholars in the academy, we've come to believe that it's Matthew using Mark. And Matthew's thought to have been a disciple of Jesus, but why would a disciple of Jesus use a non-disciple of Jesus as his source? Well, this is not, I'm not trying to resolve this issue right now. I'm trying to actually explain what the phrase, one of the biggest things, and one of the topics that I'm like, Peter's supposed to be charging, and it says it's going to die soon. I'm trying to figure out what time it is. What time is it, my friends? Yeah, I want to end. I'm going to end on this note, okay? The question. There is a question to ask here. And the question is, what is the relationship between the synoptic gospels? How do they exhibit these features of verbatim agreement and variation? Right? Why is it that they exhibit the features the way they do? How can we explain them? And that question about how to explain the variation and the verbatim agreements between the three synoptic gospels is known as the synoptic problem. I gave you an article to read for today about this. I apologize if for the diligent student who has already read this article, if I'm repeating too much the information that you got in that article, but if you're now curious about it, you go back and you read that article by Styler on the synoptic problem that was assigned for today, and you'll get a little bit more of a glimpse into how scholars work on this question of verbatim agreement and variation among the three synoptic gospels. Now, one of the things that I think, we could read them in synopsis like this all the time and just keep saying, why is this? Why is this? Why is that? But what I think we're going to do, and what I know we're going to do because I designed the syllabus, what I want to do with you, instead of going line by line, comparing the parallels, talking about them, is I want you to take it on my word for it. I don't want you to take it on faith, but I want you to take my word for it that these verbatim parallels and variation are there and visible if we lay them side by side. Instead, I want to spend the next 3 classes going in depth over Mark, then Matthew, then Luke. And I would like to try to allow that material to emerge. We will do some synoptic comparisons as we do that, but we're going to start with the basic assumption of Styler and many others that the one solution to the synoptic problem is this, that you have this early period of oral sources and oral traditions, people saying things about Jesus like, he's a prophet, he healed my sister, or he cast a demon out of my cousin, or all these oral traditions. And then they started to coalesce into writings. And then early on, there was a lost source that we have that we call Q, or German word Quelle, which means source. And then another writer produced a text that we call Mark. And then later on, Matthew and then Luke wrote. And both Matthew and Luke used Q and Mark. Mark didn't use Q. And this is the most common. Oh, and also Luke had another source that we call L, which just means Luke, special Luke. Matthew had another one. And this is the sort of the pattern that is usually used to explain how there is verbatim agreement and variation, is that we don't have independent, these are texts are not truly independent, but they depend on one another. So if Mark was one of the first people to write a complete narration of the life of Jesus in his work from baptism to death on the cross to the empty tomb, Matthew and Luke both then took Mark's framework and elaborated a different story of Jesus based on it. adding material that they have that's peculiar to them. And they end up with quite different portrayals of Jesus. We have the open question I asked earlier, why 4 gospels? Why 4 different gospels? We've got to come back to that too. I'm sorry, I wanted to not quite keep you this long today, but I really appreciate your energy and attention today. I really do. Long class period. We'll see you on the interwebs via Zoom on Tuesday. I have not posted the week 2 assignments yet, but I will do so soon. And I will also build out the structure for discussion contributions and things like that. Oh, and the week 1 homework, that module is already up. So, no. Yes, no. Is it there's, oh gosh. I'll email you with reminders.
For week 1,
Yeah, there's the
journal entry.
The journal entry, that's what I'm trying to come up with. Thank you. I'm like, what?
Sir,
Yes, sir.
Tuesday class, I have an overlapping class.
Yeah, what's the deal there?
Okay, I don't know how that came along. So basically, it's my senior sem. So it's
Yeah.
kind of like a floating class. So that was the only time we could coordinate for all of us. Get it? But it's only about 50 minutes.
So she doesn't need to keep you.
Yeah, she doesn't even keep me that long. Really. So I'll
Because
just
it's a research class.
yeah, exactly. So I'll just like.
Well, it's obviously super important that you do your senior sem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'll speak to her. She's cool. So
Yeah, so we get along fine.
yeah.
I wouldn't want to tread on Heather's turf.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
the last thing you want is for Heather to argue against you.
True. I have 3 weekends.
You too, like
Oh, can I email you my discussion?
late.
Yeah, because I didn't see email, so I woke back up from my 8 a.m. class that she had opened the discussion tab.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, because then that just means you got bamboozled. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll give you credit if you email this time. All right. And I won't make the same mistake again.
Okay.
All right.
You have a good day.
You too.
I know the assignment, the journal entry is due at 5. I just didn't.
No, it shouldn't be due until noon on Sunday.
The journal entry says submit by October 8th, 5 o'clock.
Submit by 5 or opens at 5. It should open the submissions at 5 today.
It might say that.
And then
It'll be available from.
available from. Yes, yes. I'm sorry to give you a fright.
That's okay. I was just confused on how it completed her.
I didn't mean to give you a fright there.